It's just interest.
All right. All right. I'm Jeff Browse, and I'm with the Stanford Historical Society. And tonight we have a guest speaker, Mr. Dillon Streifeneder. And thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Let me tell you a little bit about Dillon. He is a historian of colonial America and the early American Republic. His current project focuses on state formation and governance in New York during the era of the American Revolution. Streifeneder received his PhD from Ohio State University. He is currently an assistant professor of history at the United States Naval Academy, and he is also a native of the Hudson Valley, having grown up in Red Hook. He currently resides in the city of Poughkeepsie, and let's give a round of applause and welcome to the site.
Thank you. Well, good evening. Thank you for having me here. It's nice to be back in the Hudson Valley. So I think I have to open up by saying that anything that I say tonight are my thoughts and opinions, and they are not in no way reflective of the United States Naval Academy or the wider United States Naval Service. So got that off the bat. But welcome, and again, thanks for having me. So tonight, we're going to talk about local governance in the era of the Revolution. So we'll sort of give a sweep of what it looks like from the colonial period, the late colonial period, because the colonial period is quite large. And then we'll sort of get into the opening of the Revolution and what we'll see and how things will start to change. So if I were to ask you what comes to mind when you think about local governance, and you can think about that as like, where is local governance, who is part of local governance, and what does it do? And this is an open question to the floor. Who's in control? Okay.
Where is the seat of governing?
Okay, so where is the seat of governing? Certainly. Okay, and where do we think where do we associate that with local government? Poughkeepsie. Okay. All right. Very good. All right. So what level is that at? The county level. Okay. All right. Great. So we're going to talk about that a bit tonight. Okay. Other thoughts?
Well, on the smaller towns, their annual meeting.
Okay. So the towns, the annual meeting. Excellent. Great. Okay. So election of officers. So are most of our officials pretty much they're all elected in this day and age. So that wasn't always the case. All right, so that's a great starting point. I'm glad we said the county and we said the town. So the first thing I want to sort of get up here is thinking about reconsidering where, when, how this period of history comes about, especially in the case of New York and where New York fits in wider scholarship. So I highlight this book by Jack Green in part because he lays out the work of a host of other historians that takes place during the 1980s and 1990s. So within the wider writing of history, 1970s is sort of like this watershed moment for local history. You have a host of professional historians that finally, for like the first time in forever, take very seriously the work of genealogists as well as local historians and local historical societies. So you're going to get pouring out of, now part of that's tied around the bicentennial, the celebration of the 200th of the United States. But it's also going to be sparked by sort of like this revival and interest in local histories, particularly the town. New England is going to be the place where this happens. Now, a lot of that is made possible because New England saved every single scrap of paper possible. And so you have a lot to write about. And so you get town studies for, you name the town, they have a town study now. But so Green, in the sort of years following the 1970s, he's writing in the late 1980s, and this will continue into the 1990s and into the 2000s. He looks closely at what that earlier body of scholarship did and how it came to define American historical writing. And he's going to argue that there are 4 key assumptions that are associated with that earlier scholarship. The first of those assumptions is that New England was a far more exact replica of what life looked like in Old England than what was happening in the Chesapeake. particularly Virginia is going to be the big one, but also Maryland, Delaware, and even into bits of Carolina. So that's the first thing, is that New England looks more like Old England. Second, New England, again, rather than the Chesapeake, its experience was normative in the Anglo-American colonial development. So again, New England is the norm. They're the standard. The Chesapeake is weird. Third, that a model or framework could be derived from that New England experience that we can use to understand the entire colonial experience across all of Britain's colonies. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, and I throw this back as well to, like, I guess it's not thrown around as much anymore, but right, Ronald Reagan, City on a Hill speech, right, the sort of this Puritan heritage. This fourth one is that American society, as it develops from the colonial period onwards, in many ways derived its key attributes from, you guessed it, New England, not the Chesapeake. And that the Puritan tradition evolved directly into the traditions that are, we would associate as being American today. Now, for a very long time, these assumptions were fundamental to historical scholarship. And so the only issue with that is, generally speaking, what's the problem with assumptions? Yeah. Okay, all right, we got someone that got it. All right. So the problem with this is that New England, in many ways, and we can get into a little bit more, is perhaps the oddity, and that the Chesapeake is perhaps the norm. Why does this matter? Bear with me just a second. So generally speaking, we're going to get two different forms of government that emerge with two different types of society. So we'll look at New England first. At the center of New England society stands the town, the New England town, this quintessential thing of New England. This is both a key civil jurisdiction, and it's also of great social importance. As settlers spread across New England, they established new towns. These were closely, tightly knit, community-oriented villages. They put enormous emphasis on establishing well-ordered communities with strong, extended, and highly patriarchal families that preserved social control and had a high degree of peace. Now, local government was intended to maintain, the words they continue to throw around over and over and over again, are a well-ordered or well-regulated society. Authority should be close by, easily exercised, and respected. To do this, New England towns relied on the town meeting government in particular, along with other overlapping deliberative bodies. So generally speaking, the town would have a meeting every single month, if you're a newer town. If you're a more established town, they sort of dropped off a little bit. But generally speaking, you would have a town meeting in which every single member of the town could gather together and voice their opinions, deal with issues. Outside of that, there were elected town selectmen. So that's sort of what we see over here, every single one of these towns. The town selectmen would deal with issues when the town meeting wasn't happening. So, for instance, say your neighbor's hogs got into your field and destroyed your crops. Rather than waiting around for the whole month, you could go to the town selectmen, voice your grievances, and they would arbitrate and find some sort of solution to sort of solve your problem. Now, that's really important because what that does is prevents sort of like local bickering and feuds from exploding into perhaps violence. So that's happening outside the town meetings. There's also justices of the peace that are sort of above that at the county level. But as you can see sort of in this, almost everything's elected. So the towns send representatives to an assembly that will meet in Boston, in the case of Massachusetts, but this is also happening in Connecticut and Rhode Island and New Hampshire. So that's how that will function. This town-based world. That's New England. Now, things are different in the Chesapeake. Quite different. Part of that is based on settlement patterns. Now, local government in Virginia was based on the county as the main geographic and political unit. The county court was the most important sort of institutional body, rather than the town court and the town meeting. The county court is sort of this in-between, between sort of the local people and a distant, sort of absent government. The counties are divided into parishes, but that's primarily sort of an administrative unit. And each month, the county court would meet, presided over by justices of the peace. Now, outside the monthly meetings, the JPs operated in groups and as individuals, providing daily governance. And in many ways, the JP was the visible, tangible structure of county government. They were appointed, and that's key. They're not elected. They're appointed by the royal governor. There are no elected officials in Virginia. Actually, oddly enough, it's going to stay that way pretty much up until like the 1850s. So it continues on in that way. Whereas New Englanders are electing everyone under the sun, that is not happening in the Chesapeake. You have appointed officials who govern. Now, ideally, these are supposed to be country gentry. They're supposed to be like mimicking the aristocracy in Great Britain. So these individuals become justices of the peace. They are supposed to keep the peace, but they do a host of things beyond that as well. So to be effective, a JP had to be respected by his neighbors. The JP's house, in many ways, often became a focal point that defined the neighborhood. It's in the house that it would become a meeting place where people would come to the JP to resolve their issues rather than having to go before the county court. So these are the two systems we start to get. So back to Jack Green and the generation of scholars that have looked to demonstrate what was life like by comparison to Old England. And their overwhelming conclusion is that the Chesapeake experience was actually normative, and that New England is really weird. New England is sort of this oddball exception that the rest of not just North America, but also places like English colonization of Ireland, English colonization of the Caribbean and into Canada, all sort of follows more of a Chesapeake model than the New England model. All right, so if I haven't lost you yet, and you're not, you're sitting there wondering, that's all fine and dandy. I came here to hear about local government, like in New York. Why are we talking about the Chesapeake and New England? This matters a lot because New York's model of governance is going to fall in line with this. But for a really long time, the shadow of New England, what we have over here, has played a role in sort of leading to other assumptions. That, well, New York is pretty close to New England, and we do have towns, which will be a sort of thing further on when we will get towns. So therefore, New England's experience is probably pretty similar to New York's. Great. And I'm here to tell you it's not. And so much of the rest of this night we'll sort of dig in to see where and how things differ from New England and sort of how the New York experience plays out and develops into the Revolution. So why is it different? What happens? What's the deal with New York? So prior to New York being New York, it was New Netherland. So permanent settlement under the Dutch was slow and really unsuccessful. It focused around its two largest towns, the sort of lower tip of what is today Manhattan Island, and present-day Albany, New York. The Dutch established patroonships. So these are a quasi-feudal system in which essentially the Dutch government granted a very wealthy individual, a patroon, a huge chunk of land. And sort of like the bargain that goes with that is, I'm going to grant you a massive chunk of land, and you are going to be able to convince a host of settlers to come with you and settle that land. Inside of those patroonships, the patroon was responsible for government. They could hire their own agents to administer life inside of there. They were allowed to organize their own courts of law inside of their patroonships. And many of them wind up hiring a series of sort of agents to act on their behalf. Now, simultaneously, township government does start to gain a foothold on what is today Long Island. So you have some New Englanders that migrate from New England onto Long Island, and they start to set up local governments. Now, the central problem, if we see our timeline here of sort of transformation, is that very few Dutch settlers actually moved to New Netherland. By 1664, anyone out here know the rough population of Dutch settlers in New Netherland? Like a high, low? Any brave soul want to throw out a number? 2,000? Okay. I mean, that's actually, it's lower. So it's 9,000. 9,000 people spread from Manhattan north of Albany. Part of the problem with this system is that most of the settlers who show up, their intent is not actually to stay. They come, they want to get in on the fur trade, and they want to go back to the Netherlands. And so they don't settle permanent settlement. So they're not cultivating the land in the manner that the English will. So instead of that, we get this sort of haphazard, like scattered settlement, rather than these sort of like nicely close-knit New England towns. You have people just sort of scattered across the land. All right, so why does that matter? That's what the English take over. Now, I highlight this here. The English are going to take over in 1664. The Dutch are actually going to take it back in 1674. And then in 1677, the English will take it back once again. That sort of concludes a series of Dutch and English wars in which the English are triumphant. And from that point on, New York will be an English colony. So early on, New York is, when it's first possessed by the English, it's actually the personal possession of the Duke of York, James Stuart. He's the brother of the king, Charles II. And for 22 years, New York was a ducal proprietorship. It's run by what are referred to as the Duke's laws, which are essentially anything he says goes. He has a governor that is responsible, because the Duke of York, right, you're the king's brother. You're not going to go to New York. It's a backwater. Why would you go there when you can live up life in London? And so I highlight that as well, because James is like notorious for having a host of mistresses and partying and gallivanting on throughout the night. So he's not going to New York. He sends a royal governor who's responsible for governing, but the governor doesn't really have any like serious guidance. There's no other body that's on the ground. So he basically gets there, he asks a handful of sort of well-to-do individuals what's going on here, and they kind of organize a government. When Charles dies and James becomes King James II, he's no longer the Duke of York. And so New York transfers from being his own personal property to kind of being his own personal property, but as a royal colony of England. At that point in time, New York finally is allowed to establish like an official government rather than being his sort of plaything. And so they're going to establish a local legislature to pass laws. Now, that's going to get overturned in 1688. New York becomes part of this thing called the Dominion of New England. It doesn't really matter. Big picture, though, is that by 1691, things finally get hammered out. And we're going to get a government that I would say is pretty familiar to what we have today. There's going to be an executive, a legislature, and a judicial branch. So the executive will be a royal governor appointed by the king. Your legislature will be elected individuals who represent the people. They pass laws. And we'll have a judiciary, which will take the form of both a Supreme Court as well as county-level courts. Now, in addition to that, there will be a council, which is kind of unfamiliar for us today, but so that sort of is like trying to replicate in Parliament how you have like the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Now, of great importance for this is that they reorganize the province. They get rid of these patroonships altogether, or sort of holdovers of them that had sort of transitioned into these English manors. And they're going to create, as you can see up here, 10 counties. And those counties will pretty much persist throughout the entire rest of the colonial period. By 1772, they're going to add 4 new counties. But at this point in time, there will be 10 counties that are organized for the period. Unlike the Chesapeake, however, that has parishes underneath the counties, New York is going to have this changing, fluid patchwork that is incredibly chaotic and confusing, of jurisdictions below the county level. So they will consist of some towns, but they also have boroughs. And then they're also going to have wards, and then they're going to have manors, but then they'll also have districts, and they'll also have precincts. None of them are exactly the same. So we get this sort of like chaotic organization that'll sort of be under the counties. But so the big thing here is, again, the counties. Just like in the Chesapeake, that will be the like premier civil jurisdictional entity. That's where we're going to find the most active government officials operating at. And again, those government officials primarily will be appointed, not elected. So unlike the quasi-democratic world of locally elected officials in New England, with its town government, the most important county officials will be appointed in New York. New York system is going to be centered on a different official, and that's going to be the Justice of the Peace, which is a holdover from England itself. So here is my attempt to like visualize how this system functions. So here's our sort of like big branches of government, right? You have a royal governor, you have the assembly who passes laws. They pass laws, and like, this is like one of the ongoing questions, and this can occur today. Like, so when the New York State Legislature passes a law up in Albany, how does it get applied here in Stanford? Who? It doesn't? Okay. Through the executive, and does the executive, so in this case is the governor, is Kathy Hochul personally coming to Stanford and being like, I'm enforcing that law? Through the counties, okay. And who does the counties have? The various towns, and there's a host of officers that all fall under somebody. Okay, so this is going to be like one of the sort of conundrums of this colonial period is how do you get local officials to actually carry out the things that you write, in this case, in distant New York City? Like, how do we know up here in what that during this period is going to be Charlotte Precinct that the officials are actually doing what the statutes say? But so generally speaking, we have a similar like connect the dots to how you get things enforced. So when they pass the statutes, those generally speaking are given to the magistrates or justices of the peace. I'm probably going to refer to those to just simply JPs for the rest of the evening so I don't have to continue to say that over and over. So JPs. So the JPs are going to be supposed to be in every single one of these various localities, whether that's a precinct or a ward or a town or a district or a manor. We'll have JPs. And the JPs are going to be like the central cog. So they'll get the law, should get the law. At that point, they're going to work with a host of other local elected officials. So we'll see in a moment sort of the original record books from what was Charlotte Precinct, which part of that becomes Stanford. And those is where we're going to have our town meetings once a year. We'll elect all of these other local officials at those meetings. And then the JP is kind of like the team captain who's going to direct the rest of those officials to go out and do their jobs. The JP is also providing like oversight. So when the assessors go out and do their assessment, they're essentially the backstop, ensuring that they do it the correct way. The overseers of the roads, the JP is going to be around to ensure that, yeah, you said that you worked for 7 days, but I'm pretty sure you only worked for 5. You can't charge the community for 7 days. So that's what's going on. Now, they're also going to be well-respected individuals and have to work with non-elected officials, but just heads of households, so people that live in the community. And that's where we're going to get sort of our outcomes of these things. All right, so here we go. So where do we get these elected officials from? So this is the record book. So this is the precinct at the time. It's Charlotte Precinct. So Charlotte Precinct includes what is today Stanford, Washington, Pleasant Valley, Hyde Park, and Clinton. There we go. Yep. So that's essentially what Charlotte Precinct was. So every single year, usually it would be like the first week in April of every year, the town would get together and would elect new officials. So that's what they're doing over here. So at the annual town meeting, held in April 1766, they're going to choose William Doughty as the clerk. They're going to choose Tobias Stoutenberg as the supervisor. They're going to, and so on and so forth. So that's what we have going on here. If you would like to go, you can see this book. It's at the Adrian's Library in Poughkeepsie, or you can find a transcribed version of it, which is available online for free on like Internet Archive, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt transcribed back in the 1930s. But you can just flip through that, and pretty much every single page is the same thing. It's like, this is our meeting. Here's who we chose and elected. And then it will probably, after that, we'll lay out sort of like the various highway districts of who's responsible for those areas. Now, in addition to that, we've got over here the supervisor books. So, right, here we go, Tobias, right? He was elected, or sorry, yeah, he was chosen as the supervisor. He's going to go and meet also once a year with the other supervisors from the other precincts across Dutchess County. They're going to get together, they're going to meet, and they'll usually wind up, I sort of refer to them as kind of like glorified accountants. They're pretty much going to go through the county's books, verify that any expenses have been paid out, and then, but beyond that, that's what's going on like at the town meeting. So if we think about like governance and actual like day-to-day stuff, it's not actually happening at this meeting. Rather, they're choosing individuals at the meeting who are then going to go out and actually do their jobs. And a lot of that kind of gets lost in the historical record. But what kind of glues all of that together is, again, this individual that is sort of supervising most of it. And that's going to be the justice of the peace. So the JPs, again, these are appointed officials. In many ways, they're the linchpin of the entire system of government in colonial New York. They're transplanted from Old England. At the most fundamental and basic level, they receive a commission that is supposed to be the like literal embodiment of the king's authority to keep the peace. That's pretty vague, though. What might keeping the peace include? Does it mean preventing someone from murdering someone else? Could it also mean punishing someone for swearing on the Sabbath? Are those both elements of keeping the peace? Probably. So they have a wide range, and again, it's pretty vague as to what they are responsible for doing. Just like the other elements in 1691, they will officially replace any elements of town courts that are left over. And the JP is allowed to hear and try complaints and legal causes. So from an early stage, the colonial assembly, though, is going to add on to their responsibilities. So, yep, cool, you're responsible for keeping the peace. By the way, I'm going to pass a law, and then you're going to be responsible for carrying that out as well. And it's going to be a lot of laws. So between 1738 and 1775, the colonial assembly passes just shy of 1,100 laws. Roughly 55% of those 1,100 laws rely exclusively on a justice of the peace to enforce. Many more rely on some sort of combination of this team to enforce. But so these statutes are incredibly extensive. Here's some of the statutes and what they do. Preventing the destruction of fish. Preventing the sale of substandard bread, preventing stray dogs from killing sheep, but at the same time enforcing that the fencing that's around the sheep is up to par, surveying and approving proposals for new roads, verifying each person that's on the overseers of the poor intended to provide with public funds, preventing damage from stray pigs, inspecting and certifying wolves that were killed that the colony was paying out awards for, overseeing fundraising to build a new courthouse, a new jail, regulating the inoculation sites to prevent the spread of smallpox. Here's more. Regulating proper chimney and fireplace construction and the inspection process. Regulating wheel width and the distance of wagons that are going on roads in Dutchess County. Verifying proper tax assessment collection. Convicting any person caught breaking windows, doors, signs, or similar personal property. The JPs are involved in everything. And these are in many ways like the mundane, the boring, the day-to-day stuff that happens. It falls on the JP to enforce. Here's just one statute that's more extensive to see how into like the minutia and into the weeds they go. So in March 1772, the Assembly passed, quote, an act for the better regulation of the public inns and taverns. Now, this act required that JPs verify that every single inn have, quote, 3 good spare beds, 2 of which to be feather beds, with good and sufficient sheeting and covering for such beds, and a sufficient stabling of hay in the winter and hay or pasturage in the summer for at least 6 horses or other cattle. Additionally, the law required, quote, every inn holder or tavern keeper put up and fix a proper sign on or adjacent to the front of his or their house with his or their names at the foot thereof. On top of that, the justices were to ensure that the inn or tavern keeper did not, quote, sell any spirituous liquors to any apprentices, servants, or negroes, or other slave without consent of his, her, or their master or mistress. This is what the JP is supposed to be doing in their free time, right? Like they're going to every single inn in an area and ensuring that they have 3 beds, and 2 of those have to be feather beds. So to enforce the law, the JP is supposed to conduct at least a yearly inspection, but ideally an inspection every 6 months. And they are authorized to fine. They have a host of fines that they can levy on the innkeeper for being delinquent. All of those things are falling again on the JPs, and it's happening every single day. Now, where can we find this? How can we see that this is happening? It's hard. It's hard to find it. And in part, it's because their records have not been well preserved. So here I have just an example for you. So that's my hand. So the record book. So just like the town record books, this is a big leather-bound book. It currently resides in the Dutchess County Historical Society, and it's one of like 3 or 4 that has survived. Now, in part, this is a archival conundrum. So the county clerks are responsible for preserving any official government documents. But these were essentially the JP's personal property. And so, when they died, if the family didn't keep it, it was often thrown out and destroyed. So we have very few of those that have survived. But so in this particular case, this was of Roswell Hopkins. He was a justice of the peace from just over in Armenia. So Hopkins's ledger, as seen here, it's one of 4. There's also another JP, Matthew Adgate, who is up in what was Kings District. That's like Canaan in Columbia County today. There's another one from down on Long Island that's like a few months, and then another one from up just north of Albany that has survived. But so we can, there are all these thick leather-bound books, and upon examining them, you can see, for instance, Hopkins's, it says here, right, for the county of Dutchess, it's a little hard to see here, but it says actions of 5 pounds or under. And so that lets us know that this book is actually primarily just dealing with one of the laws that was passed. So it doesn't even record the host of other laws. And this is like, it's this fat-bound book. And so this is essentially dealing with primarily small debt litigation. That's primarily what it's dealing with. It's empowering the individual justice to handle a substantial share of small debt litigation throughout the colony. So what does this book show us? How often are these people acting? So in going through some of these books, if we examine these, right, we can actually kind of get an idea as to like, well, how frequently, at least in this particular case, are these JPs doing their job? And again, this is only one of the laws that was passed. But so in punching these up, we can see that his is the most complete, right, by comparison to Adgate and Frey. But generally speaking, the average number of cases that they're having per year, per month, and then how many days they're active per year and per month. And so what we get out of this, Hopkins had a total of 1,009 cases in his book. And during the period, he averages just over 84 cases per year. He spends nearly 50 days a year hearing cases related to small debt litigation. And spread across the year, he is busiest December through May. There's a noted decline in when he's hearing cases during the summer months, and he almost has, actually as well as the others, pretty much July is like the month in which they are not hearing any cases consistently. So we can kind of get that idea. All right, beyond that, in this same ledger books, we can also see sort of the places where governance is happening. And it's not some distant county courthouse. And it's also not down in New York City. It's right here in places like Stanford. And it's oftentimes inside of the justice's house. So in examining the ledgers, most of them will write stuff like where their cases are actually happening. So most of the JPs are like middling householders. A number of their occupations were farmers, cordwainers, inn or tavern keepers, millers, shopkeepers. And so while courts in particular were trying to create sort of a clearly defined world of public and private, that's not the case with the JPs. Their houses, which I think many of us today would consider sort of the realm of like your private life, were in many ways open to the public. Justice Matthew Adgate from King's District in Albany County, he frequently recorded notes such as, quote, "the parties appearing at my dwelling house." Roswell Hopkins similarly often held his proceedings in his house or down the street in his brother's house. So these events are happening inside of their homes. Now, in these spaces, the justices' proceedings often took on more of a communal-oriented outlook in which the respective JP heard complaints, they heard disputes, while sitting at their table, perhaps in front of their fireplace, perhaps while drinking some cider or beer. In similar fashion, the JPs often entered neighbors' homes when they were investigating complaints, whether inquiring about possible domestic abuse disputes between spouses, the suspicious death of an infant, the pregnancy of an unmarried woman, or supposed misbehavior by an indentured servant. Governance by the magistrates, the JPs, was often far more intimate and involved than a distant county court was. In these interactions, the justice doubled as a magistrate and a patriarchal figure of the entire neighborhood, ordering their respective community in a similar fashion as a father ordered his households. And it's in these intimate interactions and spaces that most day-to-day governance in New York occurred. So what is it that JPs did in addition to that? So here we have, this is William Doty again. He's a JP from Charlotte Precinct, which is where the area of Stanford. In this particular case, and I highlight this, these are all available online. You can go to the Ancient Document series. It's on the county clerk's website. It's a fabulous resource if you're interested, but so it's like word searchable. So for instance, if you were interested in him right there, you could type his name in and you would find which cases pop up that he was involved in that have survived. But so that's where this comes from, and it's a document in which he's essentially legally binding over a resident who is suspected of having gotten one, let's see, what is her name? Mary Ryder pregnant, out of wedlock. Now, why is he interested and involved in this? Because if she has said child, that child will then fall in the roles of the town for taking responsibility for. But if they can determine that the said individual in this particular case is the father, he would be responsible for providing child support for the child, not the town. So again, these are the actions that the JPs are taking. Other actions, here's a few examples. So this is from Matthew Adgate. There's a suit brought by the plaintiff claiming that he sustained damage from someone cutting timber on his property. Now, he had allowed the individual to cut timber on his property. And on hearing the evidence that's presented from both sides, and Adgate examines the books, that is, there's a signed agreement between these individuals, he concluded that the individual who cut down the trees, quote, had liberty to cut some large trees for timber, and it don't appear that he had exceeded the number agreed for. But the plaintiff continued to urge Adgate, sure, it looks fine and dandy in the book here, but you got to come out to my place and see what he did. So Adgate treks out to his property, and he sees that per the contract, the individual who chopped down the trees was supposed to remove the stumps. Has anyone tried removing stumps before? Yeah, oh. Said individual did not remove the stumps. So Adgate very quickly and clearly can then determine, oh, yep, in fact, you do owe the plaintiff X amount of money because you did not hold up your end of the bargain. A similar thing. 2 days later, Adgate hears a case in which a plaintiff allegedly sold the defendant 15 shillings worth of tobacco so that he could market it and provide him with the profits. But the defendant was unable to sell all of the tobacco. He sold 12 shillings of the 15 worth of tobacco. And so, in addition to that, he provided the plaintiff with a bushel of corn. And the plaintiff was annoyed, saying that he still owes me money. Adgate comes into the scene, on the spot, values that the corn was actually of more value than the tobacco was, and determines that the plaintiff actually owes the defendant extra money. But so these are the sorts of things that are happening that the JPs are carrying out. And it's quick, and it's happening inside of his house or right here in the community. Most of these cases occur within like 48 hours of a complaint being brought. Yeah?
How was this enforced, though? Was there a police force? Was there...
Yeah, so the JP had constables, but again, he's just another individual, right? But in worst case, the JP was authorized to call out the militia. So essentially a posse of individuals. So the way it's going to work is, generally speaking, the JP is supposed to issue an official warrant to a sheriff who's going to deliver the piece of paper to said individual. And at that point, the JP is relying upon other individuals, which is, and if I go back here, actually, this is like the key element. How is it enforced? Right here. The JP in many ways is relying upon the other property heads of households to help enforce, and the community to, in many ways, to help enforce. So much of the enforcement, there is not necessarily a like cudgel that can readily be applied, and it's relying upon this network and these relationships that individual has built up with the rest of the community. And it's only a sort of a last resort that they can bring a form of force into actually enforcing this. That's, yeah, great question. So that's what local governance, much of it is what it looks like, how it's happening, where it's playing out during this period. So those, again, just some of the examples. If you go through like the ledger books, like Hopkins here, right? Again, that's the Dutchess County Historical Society. I think there is a digital copy if you're interested. You can flip through the pages of this and see the host of ridiculous things that occur. And in some ways, I think it's like somewhat quaint and somewhat quirky, the things that are going on here, and laughable, as like, yep, some things never change. That keeps the system functioning. So that's like, again, sort of the everyday stuff that's happening. So here we are again. I should have had this earlier on, but so here we have like, here we are today. But so this is the wider Charlotte precinct. Here's a list of individuals that I have found who roughly from like the 1740s onwards served as JPs from Charlotte precinct. So someone, we saw him earlier, right? We also saw Tobias Stoutenberg earlier. So those are two individuals. On the eve of revolution, here are the 5 individuals who are serving from Charlotte precinct that are from this area. So that's if you're interested in sort of tracking down some of the other individuals, there they are, and there's more too that are sort of from an earlier period, but I sort of was focusing from 1740s on. All right, so I don't know. So does this system seem pretty good? Like, is it workable? Would you be like, I'd be okay with that? The justice of the peace, sort of. You think so? Okay, we've got one who's like, all right, that system seems pretty good. Okay. So yeah, I think to an extent, on the whole, like the system functioned, and that's going to be one of those things as we get into the era of the revolution that, like, a big picture, and like looking back at like the reforms that British ministers try to make and the various taxes they try to pass, there are some individuals inside the British ministry that are like, it's functioning. Don't mess with it. Don't touch anything. I know it's not exactly what you want, but it is functioning. And we get that within our local system as well. But there's going to be some problems that emerge. So, most importantly, population growth. Now, prior to the 1740s, settlement in New York clung pretty much to like Long Island and a small strip of land right up the Hudson Valley. And we're talking like pretty close to the Hudson River, is the vast majority of the population. Now, the province's population is going to explode. There's going to be a massive influx of immigrants from New England, but as well as from overseas. And the population is going to go from roughly like 60,000 inhabitants to 180,000 plus within like a 20-year period, 30-year period. That is insane, that large of a population growth. And this is happening across all of the North American colonies. Now, if you're thinking about, like, think about today. So, like, what's the population of Stanford today? 3,600? Okay. If within, so we were talking earlier tonight, right? The question about the size of the library. If within 5 to 10 years that population doubled or tripled, would Stanford have the facilities and resources necessary to accommodate that population? No. Okay. So, same problem, right, we might see today is inflicted upon, is happening to New York during this period. And so the explosion of population is not just in growth, but it's also going to be a geographic explosion. New York's population is going to spread out into today what is Vermont, used to be part of New York, as well as into the Mohawk Valley, into like Cherry Valley, pushing out beyond what is today Ulster County. It's moving away from the river. It's moving up into areas like around Lake Champlain, around Lake George. So we have this explosion that's going on, right? Now, by the 1760s, the network of justices of the peace did not keep up with that population growth. So if we have a system of governance that functions based on access to the local JP, that when the individual who had his trees chopped down could readily go and walk to the justice's house and have his problem resolved, if that is removed, the system basically stops to function, at least effectively. And your only form of resource becomes, in many cases, having to travel to, in our case, would be Poughkeepsie. Anyone wanting to travel to Poughkeepsie for a simple, regular basis, and get rid of your car, by the way, and it's winter. So it becomes more and more challenging to be able to do that. So what we see is by 1763, and I have highlighted it up here, the number of total justices. In 1763, there's roughly 359 justices serving. That does not include New York City, but the rest of the province, and reflected here. And what's interesting about this is that that's for a population of roughly 85,000 people. So we're saying there's roughly one justice for every 268 inhabitants. By 1775, there's actually 25 fewer justices, and the population outside of New York City is more than 160,000 people. Why what? Fewer. Why? Okay. Give me 1 second. We're going to get there. Is it pure negligence or is it intentional? So we're going to get a significantly higher, as you can see, the ratio of population to JP, but more importantly is that it varies by locality, right? So yeah, great. If you're in Kings County, that's Staten Island today. Great, you're still at 1 per 259, but look up here in Dutchess County. You're now at 1 per 723. In Westchester, it's 1 per 900. Same almost for Albany. And that is under the assumption that all these individuals here are actually serving, and hint, they're not. We start to run into other problems too, where like the governor is only appointing new justices every 7 or 8 years, and in that 7 or 8 year period, 5, 6, 7 of the JPs either die or they retire and are like, I'm not doing this anymore, or they move, and there's not a new appointment. So your numbers here are actually probably significantly worse. Okay, so why? Why is this happening? Between 1748 and the 1760s, British ministers sought to reform British North America and other parts of the British Empire from what they viewed as a motley collection of territories into an ordered and uniform asset for the British imperial state. What they wanted was uniformity. They wanted every single colony to have an identical form of government. They wanted every single colony to take centralized direction from London. Using the Board of Trade, an administrative body, George Montagu Dunk, the second Earl of Halifax, began to implement this plan in the 1740s and into the 1750s. Now, under Halifax, does that name ring a bell? Okay. The board establishes model colonies that they could use and experiment. One of those is going to be Nova Scotia. The other is going to be Georgia. They attempted to reform Indian policy. They wanted to increase the missionary activity of the Church of England in the area. They wanted to increase the colonial governor's authority to ensure strict adherence to laws from London. And they wanted to uniformity and standardization across the board. Now, as efforts at reform gained traction, they hit a hiccup. A little bump in the road. This guy named George Washington basically starts an international war out in the Ohio Valley, and we get the French and Indian War. Reform kind of teeters off during that period, but once it ends, it comes back with a vengeance. And you're going to get a host of officials. And I think the way that I sort of relate this today is on the eve of like American full involvement in Vietnam. JFK's administration, he brings out together Robert McNamara and this group of individuals that are sort of referred to as the whiz kids. A group of individuals who's both incredibly intelligent, but also who thinks that they know that by having a lot of information and like being able to quantify everything, you can create effective solutions. How'd that work out in Vietnam? Not too hot, right? In many ways, the response by McNamara was like, okay, we could tailor up how many bombs can we drop, and then how many numbers can we put up on a board. In some ways, I think it's helpful to think of the British administrators in a similar way. They're like, all right, if we just get a bunch of information about all of our colonies, we can then make the process happen of making them all sort of like molding them into replicas of each other. It's not going to work, but they will try to do that. In the case of New York, the individual who's going to emerge who attempts to bring about these reforms is going to be a guy by the name of Sir Henry Moore. He is a Jamaican planter. He's a temporary governor of Jamaica, and he is going to show up. He's actually boyhood friends with Halifax. He's going to show up to New York intent on enacting what he refers to a wide reformation. So he wants to enact reform, right? At the heart of Moore's program is going to be his effort to reform the system of governance with the justices of the peace. Moore comes from Jamaica, and he knows that he's reliant upon these local officials, who sometimes don't listen to what he says, to actually carry out governance. Now, he shows up, and the first thing he has to deal with is a series of agrarian riots, in which the JPs don't really respond that well. Now, he has advice. He's going to get advice from a guy by the name of William Smith, Jr. William Smith, Jr. is a professionally trained lawyer. He's going to happily provide Moore with a plan to reform the Office of the Justice of the Peace. In his plan, Smith believes that the JPs are unqualified, incompetent, overburdened, accuses a number of them being illiterate and drunkards, and he, generally speaking, would like to get rid of them. But with what? Now, don't worry, Smith has a whole proposal that's written up. You can also access that. It's on the New York Public Library's website. They've digitized all of his papers. So Smith intends to replace this highly accessible, localized system of governance that relied on JPs with a highly centralized system where professional, legally trained judges and lawyers would govern from inside the county courthouse. In our case, it would be Poughkeepsie, right? As Smith told Moore, this is a quote, government should be able to, quote, awe the people into submission. For Smith, government was something that you did to people, not for people. It was control, not providing them with public services. Now, for months, Smith is going to push this plan on Henry Moore. And eventually his plans are going to pay off. Moore is going to adopt his plan wholesale. He's going to propose adopting a whole new bench of judges, and, as he writes back to England, he proposes, quote, to reduce the list of justices of the peace to 1/3 of their present number, which I am persuaded will be very sufficient for all the purposes of their appointment. So Moore moves forward with that plan. And what we see from when Moore's first appointments go into play in 1769, that massive drop in the number of appointed justices. Now, for Moore, right, he thinks that he's solved a problem. But for inhabitants and communities without a resident justice of the peace, they now face serious disadvantages. They lack crucial administrative and law enforcement functions. Again, recall the JPs are arbitrating a range of disputes between neighbors. They're issuing licenses. They handle small debt litigation. They conduct marriages. They approve the building of bridges and roads. They enforce statutes, you name it. Without a resident local JP, those communities are essentially now left outside of government. Now, I pause here to say this is not what caused the American Revolution. But it is an important role in convincing New Yorkers to go along with the revolutionary movement when it showed up in their neighborhoods. And more importantly, to support the mechanism of revolution, and that's going to be the local committees of safety. So by definition, the committees, they're extra legal bodies. They have no legal authority. They operate outside of the established government. During the 1760s and 1770s, they arose predominantly in New England to what one historian refers to them as schools of revolution. They're going to emerge in New York in 1774, 1775, and they're intended to sort of educate and inform the inhabitants. So they're not intended to replace royal authority. So they are supposed to be able to gather and pass along information, especially from places that are like hotbeds of revolution. So like New York City, Philadelphia, Boston. And eventually they're supposed to facilitate collective effort. So how are we going to convince Britain to repeal its tax on tea? Well, we'll stop buying tea. How are you going to convince your neighbors to stop buying tea, though? Perhaps the committee could convince them by literally going door to door and saying, hey, I know you like drinking tea, but that's on principle. We need you to stop drinking tea for the next 2 months. Cool? Don't buy any more English tea. That's what the committees are doing. And so there's like this fine line, right? Like, does that sound like there should be like illegal? Or like, are they usurping government authority? Is someone going to your house and being like, hey, you should stop buying British tea? Probably not, right? And so the supporters of the crown, they have a hard time early on being like, what they're doing is annoying, but can we stop it? Like, can we use force to stop it? Now, of course, from the loyalist perspective, that's not always going to be the case. As the revolutionary movement starts taking off, the committees will start, for instance, using what loyalists might refer to as terrorist tactics. Right. So here we have from Charlotte Precinct. This is a letter that managed to get out of this area and to the royal governor. There's a party of them that call themselves committeemen and meet as often as they think fit, devising mischief against any of those that stand up for the king and parliament and doing their endeavor to demolish the law that has been established. So perhaps violence, tarring and feathering, which seems comical in like cartoon depictions, but is a horrendous, horrible thing. Right. So in the case, right, so are they patriots or are they terrorists? And it depends on from whose viewpoint. But so here we have, right, a loyalist writing about sort of what the committees are doing. Here we have, so this is taken from the town meeting minutes from Charlotte Precinct. Notice here, right, so here's 1776. By the following year, the town meeting is now, by order of the convention, so that's the New York State Convention, or almost state, under the direction of the county committee. And then here's your committee members. So have they taken over the government? Are they just happen to be individuals that are also committeemen who happen to be serving as members of the government? So a big thing here is that, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the committees, they used what they knew. The most common thing was the town meeting where everyone would get together. So we already do that. What if at the town meeting we also use it to elect, in addition to, say, like the assessors and the constable, we also elect the committeemen. So many of them will do that, and that's what's going to happen here in Charlotte Precinct. Now, in part, that's because the committees felt a need that they had to be at least perceived as being legitimate, as being kind of legally authorized. So here we have the Committee of Safety in Charlotte Precinct. Again, some of these names are going to be repeats. We were chatting the other day, I think when I was driving up here, I saw the historic sign for Isaac Bloom's Mill. Is that 82? Down that way. So here we have, right, many of these individuals will serve a host of other roles, and they'll also be committeemen. Here's two JPs, a former one and an active one. The question might be, how can you possibly hold a warrant from the king and carry out the crown's laws while also being a committeeman who's usurping that authority? But so they're going to eventually, they operate under popular sentiment. They are popularly chosen rather than appointed. All male residents, notably without distinctions for race or property requirements, were called and encouraged to vote and elect the committeemen. And by the summer of 1775, most of the committees found themselves responsible for going door to door. And their primary job is going to be trying to get people to sign on to this. So the Articles of Association is basically this statement here that says, yes, you agree with what the Continental Congress passed. It's like 14 points, 15 points maybe, that basically lists out things you will or won't do. So for instance, you're going to stop buying tea that's English tea. Cool. Are you okay to sign off on that? Maybe you are. So other statements, there's a host of statements. But so they're going to go door to door. And what this does is if you don't sign onto this document, the committee will then go and publish your name on a list. And they're going to hang it up at the town meeting hall. And they're going to print it in a newspaper. And what that's going to do is essentially ostracize those individuals out of the community. They will encourage everyone to stop doing business of any kind with that individual, but don't worry, there's a form of redemption. You can still sign the document, and then all will be forgiven, at least for a certain point of time. But so this is what the committees are doing early on. Now, when does the transition happen from official royal government to committees taking over in regards to government? And so between 1775 and 76, the committees begin to take on the role of government, and they're going to start filling a vacuum left behind by royal institutions. Now, precisely when that occurs varies by locality, but for many New Yorkers, a clear breaking point is going to come when the royal governor, William Tryon, he flees New York City, and he goes onto a British merchant ship that's in the harbor. This is actually pretty cool. He's on this ship. He has a printing press on the ship. It's like a mobile printing press, and he's going up and down like New York Harbor, up the Hudson River, and basically printing off pamphlets saying like support the king and trying to distribute them to the population. So he's doing that. But for other New Yorkers, now when he leaves, as they say here in this petition, when he quits the city, he did so without appointing a new assembly, but he hadn't prorogued or dissolved the old assembly. He also had left the province without appointing new officials, i.e. like the Justice of the Peace and the new courts. And so in their mind, he essentially left the government still in place, but unable to function. And so this presents a serious problem, in part because a significant number, what's going to happen is without those appointments, significant number of people who were carrying out day-to-day governance are going to be removed from that system. Probably upwards of 40% of the justices of the peace will wind up remaining loyal to the crown. So here's Thomas Barker, Justice of the Peace from Charlotte Precinct. He's going to remain loyal to the crown. He will eventually complain to William Tryon in a letter that he's going to write in December of 75 that he would like support, and he's not getting it. So remove those individuals that stay loyal to the crown. They're no longer JPs. So what we get here is this building effect, right? You already have less JPs. Now you have the individuals who are loyal to the crown. Remove them as well. Then there's other individuals, though, like good old Tobias Stoutenberg, who says, I'm really old, and I don't want to do this anymore. And so, right, age and other infirmities of body render me incapable of enjoying the above pleasing privilege. So you have individuals like that essentially are aged out. So remove them as well. So now it's like, how many JPs are left that are still functioning in the area? And there's no new appointments. There's not going to be any new appointments until the new government's established in 1778. So what do? How do you have your problem resolved? When your neighbor chopped down X number of trees and left you with the stumps, how do you get that problem resolved? The committees are going to start stepping in. Now, some of the committees are going to approach other JPs, and we have here this great example. So this is at a meeting of the Committee of Safety and Protection, a motion made by the board to some of the justices of the district whether they will act in civil matters. The justices then said, no. So with that being the response, how do the committees respond? Many of them are simply going to move into the role that the JPs and the former system of governance held. So here we have a few examples of this. So Northeast Precinct, that is today Pine Plains, so just a little bit north of us. As we can see here, right, the local committees are going to just start acting like the JPs did. So here we have an individual. Mr. Herman Jewell comes and he complains against John Burnett for operating a disorderly house and selling liquors without a license. So how does the committee respond? The committee is going to, just like a JP would, note some of these committeemen were former JPs, they're going to summon poor John Burnett before the board, as well as a host of other witnesses. Burnett readily admits, he says, oh, yep, sorry, I totally was operating a disorderly house without a license. I thought I had bought one, but apparently I had not. They're going to fine him £5, and then they'll issue him a license afterwards. This committee record book is filled with cases like that. There's other examples, for instance, from King's District, another one that has survived. Elijah Knapp and Elizabeth Kingsland, they're going to be brought before the committee for, quote, living together in the act of adultery, which acquisition appears to be fully true accordingly. They're going to do a similar sort of investigation. They'll bring witnesses forward. At the end of the day, they will determine that Elijah Knapp shall receive 15 lashes on the naked back, and Elizabeth Kingsland, with her children, will be escorted back to her actual home with her real husband. So that's the point being is that, again, here we have sort of these everyday happenings that the committee steps into. Yeah.
None of these people were ever elected, were they?
Which ones? The committee?
Any of these committees?
The committees were popularly elected.
They were.
Yes, which is sort of their claim to legitimacy, is that the people are sovereign, and therefore they've elected us, and therefore what we're doing is legal. So yeah, so they're going to sort of step into that role. That's going to continue, again, it's not until 1778 that the state will finally start appointing new justices of the peace. In part, because it'll run to another issue of things is how well do the committees continue to function after year 1, year 2, while they're simultaneously trying to handle the cases of John Burnett illegally selling liquor and having a disorderly house, while also trying to wage a war against Great Britain. So that pretty much brings me to the end of my presentation.
Hold on.